This is a video I have promised and had largely finished writing 2 years ago, but for various reasons I never found the time nor motivation to get it done. It's mostly because it's the first of many videos I plan to make which specifically target those of an anti-car mindset. Chiefly urbanists, but also environmentalists and really anyone else I feel who have been exploited, radicalized and then swept up by extremist propaganda and fear-mongering outlets into harmful cults which reside on websites such as Twitter and Reddit in particular, adopting opinions which aren't so much their own as ones they've been fed by various vested interests as part of a monolithic groupthink. These individuals have got it firmly into their heads that the world's governments have spent the past century colluding with the world's leading automotive manufacturers and media production companies alike to force cars, in much the same way they forced diamonds, upon a worldwide population that have now become dependent on them, as though they were some sort of four-wheel drug that we need to be collectively weaned off of when, if they were a benevolent and forward-thinking government, impervious to industry lobbying, could have spent the time and money building some quasi-utopian public transport infrastructure built in such a way so that everything you ever wanted was never further than a 2-mile commute away. And if you question those ideas in any way, you're evil. Welcome everyone to the world of the modern-day urbanists. People who live and die over the concept of a walkable city, one which they struggle to accurately define and probably weren't clamouring for prior to the year 2020 when certain YouTubers told them it was something they were supposed to want, and simply cannot see how easily it can serve as a Trojan horse for greater government oversight in urban areas, who will then over-pedestrianise and make the act of driving prohibitively difficult and expensive if you wish to live anywhere in the civilised world. People who will look at the infrastructural nightmare that was the Kowloon-walled city and say that there was a lesson to be learned, not a warning to be heeded. And even if they live outside of the US, they will beg for more of this to be built in spite of the fact the vast majority of UK and European cities are already what would be considered walkable by default, and to render them any more walkable outside of adding more pavements would only result in actively discriminating against the majority of tax-paying road users who choose to drive, making their lives more difficult for the gratification of a far smaller minority. In a world where we're now drilling holes into cows to circumvent their natural biological processes because the only viable alternative is to kill them en masse, everyone else is slowly being consumed and radicalized by a maddening doctrine that is equal parts saviour complex as it is pure authoritarian impulse. A misguided green crusade which in recent years has mutated from a minor nuisance of undisciplined children striking from school because a child of the elite told them to, or a fat old gammon in a high-vis jacket blocked a main road because they'd finally ran out of pots and pans to bang every morning, to acts of petty vandalism and civil disobedience which often ended up causing more damage to the protesters' own bodies through the consequences of their very own very stupid actions than anyone or anything they sought to inconvenience, all the way through to acts of stochastic terrorism by those who are fully convinced that what they are doing is for the greater good and appeasing the invisible science daddy in the sky, therefore any mortal laws should not apply to them. All I'll say is the urbanist is a curious fellow built mostly out of spite, jealousy, generationally bad financial decisions, one hell of an inferiority complex, and deeply seated resentment for people who choose to live a life differently to theirs and are not afraid to violently lash out in the name of their religion. And although it's been fun and enjoyable watching a certain fellow of a musky persuasion receive his long outstanding comeuppance after 2 successive smackdowns in the courts courtesy of Mr. Clarkson was simply not enough to make people begin questioning his alleged genius, I feel it is very important to state that what has happened in 2025 is a far more alarming sign of how easily ordinary people can be coerced into committing acts of private property destruction on a mass scale, purely through the psychological influence of the news and social media cycle alone. And given the average intellectual capacity of said vandals, including several unlucky sods whose Chinese-owned Swedish-badged Polestars ended up amongst the victims of their worldwide assault, it doesn't take the wildest imagination to predict how those very same people could then be subsequently radicalized even further into attacking vehicles manufactured by other marques entirely once given a suitable reason to feel outrage. Teslas today and TVRs tomorrow, as this patriotic, free-thinking rocket scientist so kindly demonstrates. And that is a future I desperately want to avoid. To that end, this series, which I have christened No Gasoline, is a lifetime's worth of one car enthusiast's personal grievances and bitterness with the world, aired out as part of a series which will continue for however as long as I like. This inaugural episode, in order to set the tone for those that will follow later on, focuses on public transport, more specifically public transport in France. Because when I first wrote this script in April 2023, the SNCF, France's nationalised rail service, released this advert under the campaign of Born to be Wild. In English, through my A2 understanding of French, the advert's tagline roughly translates to, "And is true freedom riding the train?" with C in this instance being used as an intensifier. Over on YouTube, the original advert has 6.2 million views along with a suspect like-dislike ratio in disabled comments, but it was on Twitter where this advert really took off. Because once it fell into the hands of the great anti-car circle jerk that populates it, they simply could not get enough of it. Their cause finally managing to attract the attention of a major government-run entity such as the SNCF was like digital crack to them, and it was promptly reposted by this jobless tosser who has built his entire identity around hating cars and twerking for a subreddit that sounds like a fan club for that one guy on My Strange Addictions. Don't worry, there will be a video focusing on this specific aspect of the cult as well, but that will likely come once this series proves itself to be popular or not. Now, I myself am not the biggest fan of public transport out there. In the UK, coverage has historically never been that awful, though as is the case with much of the West, your experience typically varies between substandard and dangerous. I myself understand the need for public transport at its most basic level, and I don't harbour an irrational hatred for it, but I do not consider it anything more than an obligatory service for the less fortunate of us who are otherwise physically or financially unable to obtain their own means of transport. To me, it serves the same purpose in modern society as temporary housing or food stamps. Something that can help you get around as opposed to walking everywhere, but not something you're supposed to rely on for your entire life. For many years before I was 18, I wanted to learn to drive. I wanted to be self-sufficient from as early in life as I could possibly be, and to explore the world around me at my own pace and in my own time. But various economic and physical limitations reared their ugly head. By the time I was finally in a position to get my license, the lockdowns happened and that put things on bricks for another couple of years. So, like Phil Leotardo, I compromised. For 10 years, I primarily relied on buses to get around my city, and I hated just about every single aspect of it. I hated the long waits at bus stops and terminals, especially in adverse weather conditions. I hated all the delays, cancelled services and breakdowns. I hated the endless stops and detours which turned what would have been a much shorter journey in a car into a far longer one. I hated the lack of climate controls, especially on hot summer days. I hated getting on overcrowded buses and having to stand or sit next to people I didn't want to. I hated loud, rambunctious youths having fights, throwing things or causing other sorts of disruptions, and hopefully there will come a day I will never want nor need to ride another bus ever again. Because to me, regularly commuting via bus is just a unilaterally awful experience and not something I'd want to wish on anybody. Thankfully, the UK isn't quite up to the level of sleeping passengers being set on fire while nearby police officers stare uselessly at the human inferno that ensues, but we aren't as far off from that reality as you might think, despite the protestations of pearl-clutching Redditors who think your well-founded apprehension is bigotry. Today, if you want to use the London Underground, for instance, the very first thing you will see are paid advertisements telling you that if you have the slightest thing wrong with you that basic medicine can't cure, that you are a burden to the British taxpayer and NHS alike, and you should kill yourself. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. As you then make your way to the turnstiles, there'll probably be a customer or two in front of or behind you who'll jump to then dodge the fare. Some of them into the tens of thousands of pounds, and if you even try and call this behaviour out, they'll most likely pull a knife on you and threaten to turn you into a statistic. Once on the tube, you will then be treated to the wonderful sights of several young men marking the seats with their own urine as part of their gang turf. But thankfully you won't have to record such a disgusting event, because your phone had already been nicked half an hour earlier while walking down the street by a hooded fellow on a bicycle. Now, of course, this won't happen every single time you choose to travel on a service such as the London Underground, But the fact is, it does happen, and no amount of denial can change that. Calling such events outliers or otherwise playing down their severity, as many pro-public transport sources tend to do, does not erase the fact that many light rail services in the Western Hemisphere have been completely ruined by antisocial louts and a general lack of law and order, where if you're unlucky enough to ride the Paris Metro on any given Thursday, you'll get to experience a little bit of this. For those who don't know, this guy has 1.5 million followers on TikTok, and if you're unable to see just how disruptive and disrespectful this sort of act is, you are part of the problem. When I get on a train or other form of rail transport, I do not personally want a 40-year-old glasses-wearing man-child in a freezer shirt to start jumping up and down and making dog noises. Now, if these things are a setup and the entire carriage is filled with human extras being paid to act shocked or whatever, fair play. But if you're doing that during real people's work and school commutes, and I have anything to say about it, then personally, you are getting your lights knocked out. But I digress. The advert begins with a bunch of motorcyclists breaking down in front of a rail crossing, where a train proceeds to pass them by at breakneck speeds. There are certainly other factors at play here. It is worth noting that not even a few seconds in and the advert is already cringe-worthily appealing to the sort of identity politics these people unhealthily invest a lot of their time in, by contrasting these unhappy, out-of-shape older white men against the comparatively happier, healthier younger train riders of a much more varied metropolitan background. It's subtle, but it is there, and it's annoying. And this is exactly what I want you to notice. Because in order for propaganda to work, there are a number of elements it must contain. I call this system pivot, and it's one you might be familiar with if you've ever seriously studied or researched propaganda in your own spare time. Because its overall goal is to pivot those with a moderate outlook into buying whatever it is you're selling. If you fail to do that, it's not a good piece of propaganda. The P stands for priming. In order for propaganda to work, it has to find a way to relate itself to an onlooker who might hold otherwise incompatible views. So in a video you're going to see perhaps a few weeks from now talking about the travesty that is the new Ford Capri, the insidious way they chose to promote that car was to digitally insert it into old adverts of the original, shamelessly using the 40-year-old corpse of the original Capri to try and sell this new hunk of crap. This was done so as to suggest that if you liked Ford's original Capri, you will like this pile of overweight, electrified, sellout dog shit as well. It's like how Flora have got the likes of Gordon Ramsay to advertise its butter substitute. Ramsay is a well-respected world-class chef, so if he tells you a butter substitute is as good as the real thing, you are much more likely to take his word for it than some random guy you've never met in real life. The I stands for interest. What is this made in the interest of? Obviously, in this instance, it's for the French government's rail service. It's the least important aspect because every advert has to have an interest, otherwise it's just not an advert. V is for values, and there are two different types, the conscious and the subconscious. Conscious values are spelled out to the viewer to ensure there is no confusion over what the intended message is, but the subconscious is only noticeable if you have trained yourself to notice it. Otherwise it completely passes you by, and that is its intent. Think of it as the advert talking behind your back. You're not supposed to hear it, but if you do, you learn what it really thinks of you. O is for opposition, and it is the advert's job to demonize them as much as possible, to depict them as unreasonable and as unlikable as they'd like you to think. You have to make it seem like if you oppose the messaging or the product in the advert, you have to be insane. You have to be on the wrong side of history. Finally, the T is for target, and it's the audience the propagandist wishes to target the most. In this case, it is younger people who, due to the continually worsening economy throughout much of the Western Hemisphere and indeed the world at large, is being made to decide between self-actualization in getting a driver's license along with all the responsibilities that come with owning a car, or spending their entire life helplessly dependent on public transport. Having explained the 5 aspects of good propaganda, its main subconscious value is the deliberate conflation of private automobile ownership with the outgoing generation of older adults, alongside the outdated ideologies they represent, such as colonialism, for instance. You aren't told this consciously because then you'll realise what you're agreeing with, but the artistic intent of the advertising firm the SNCF commissioned, Rosa Paris, is crystal clear. They picked some haggard, pot-bellied older white men because it is their job to seem as unappealing as possible. You do not want to associate with these individuals or any ideas they may be aligned with. Ideas such as owning your own form of transport and maintaining it over a long period of time. The camera even deliberately spends the least amount of time possible looking directly at the bikes and keeping them to the extreme edges of the frame because they do not want you to think the bikes look cool. After a grand total of 4 seconds of screen time of actually showing the train, the thing the advert is supposed to promote, we then cut from it to a bunch of random activities anyone can do if they happen to live within a certain amount of miles, and is certainly not exclusive to those who use the train, such as tombstoning off a cliff into the freezing waters below, or trespassing on someone else's farmland. From there we continue to switch back and forth between the happy, multicultural youngsters getting themselves into all sorts of wild and wacky hijinks, and the bitter, older gentlemen of a bleachy complexion who are spending most of their vacation trying to fix their ailing bikes. The conscious and subconscious values are employed in equal amounts in order to strengthen its resolve towards the intended target, younger people who are choosing not to obtain their driver's license. The advert is basically turning to its viewers in their teens and early 20s and asking them, do you want to associate with these old losers who can't enjoy a holiday because their bikes keep breaking down? Or would you rather instead take the train and meet these younger, happier people who should be your friends? The advert then decides to rather predictably end with the urbanist's second favourite canard next to bad, misleading death statistics, gridlock. Even though anyone with a basic degree of common sense should be able to tell you that's not really ever a problem on a motorcycle, for reasons that should be immediately obvious to anyone with the same number of brain cells as a motorbike has wheels, they've decided to end this advert by depicting our beloved bike riders as the victims of a particularly nasty traffic jam, because it's really their only major argument when all the positives of private transport are brought into consideration. But at least you're not stuck in gridlock. Except for when a moderately sized tree branch falls and the whole system comes crashing to a halt over a leaf since a train can't steer. Or as I experienced, how a single electronic failure can cripple a large portion of an entire transport network in much the same manner. Or how a train ride can just cancel itself even if you're already on it and leave you stranded for a number of hours. Finally, we have the closing shot of the browbeaten motorcyclists looking defeated at the comparatively faster-moving train. As the advert draws to a close, the SNCF claim that their trains represent truer freedom than riding around on a motorbike or any other type of self-driven transport. Because nothing, and this is something that genuinely makes me pop a blood vessel every time I have to hear an urbanist unironically try to suggest this, nothing screams freedom like being a slave to a nationalised, state-run corporation that runs its vehicles on a set schedule and route map, one that a lot of the time it can't even keep to, that you then have to fit your entire life around, along with all sorts of undesirables you occasionally meet on buses and trains, like Monsieur Tok Tok for instance. How exactly does waking up earlier than you want to, standing around at a station, going miles out of your original intended way because it has to pick up hundreds of other passengers, and praying you aren't at the mercy of a glitch, malfunction, or some arsonists destroying critical infrastructure, better than just casually hopping on a machine that you yourself have bought and maintained, and going wherever you want, whenever you want? And then it finally occurred to me. Urbanists and their ilk do not actually understand the concept of automotive enthusiasm. From start to finish, the advert does not even make an attempt to convey riding pleasure, because again, that would be defeating the purpose of the advert. You don't want to make riding your own motorcycle look even the slightest bit enjoyable, because you might actually end up costing your potential customer base. But part of me believes the people who made this advert cannot even comprehend the idea of enjoying driving or riding your own personal vehicle. And it's a recurring theme you often see in a lot of urbanist rhetoric. They do not understand why you might not want to be in a vehicle where you are forcefully surrounded with potentially hundreds of other people who you do not spiritually align with. They do not get why you would rather put yourself through gridlock and a statistically heightened risk of dying instead of just getting on the bus like the rest of them. To them, we are like slaves to car dependency that they genuinely believe they are trying to free from shackles only they can see, and they cannot understand why we just rather continue living in what they perceive to be abject slavery. That it's better to give a big corporation what seems like a small fee on a routine basis for supposedly unlimited enjoyment, than to go things our own way and divine our own enjoyment. And this is readily apparent for much of the reception towards this advert, especially from the anti-car urbanist crowd. But here's the thing I didn't notice back in 2023. Even then, a lot of people were disagreeing with the advert's overall message, even in an echo chamber as contained as this colossal Smooth Brains Twitter feed. And that made me smile, if only for a short while, because it meant that even in an enemy field as hostile as this one, where the staunch urbanist crowd applauded the advert in their thousands, there was still a lot of people who thought it was a load of horse shit. That it was a dishonest, disrespectful distortion of how the real world works. That people don't become car or motorbike enthusiasts because the road infrastructure they have grown up in forces them to own such vehicles, as a lot of urbanists otherwise insist, but because we are genuinely passionate over them. And that is something they can sadly never understand. Because the SNCF made this advert with such a hateful message behind it, were I to ever visit France, I am now extremely unlikely to ever board a train ran by the SNCF, since it's clear the company holds nothing but contempt for the hobbies I hold dear. Again, just to reiterate, I get that there are really good public transport services out there. The SNCF itself might even be one when it's not striking or playing host to morons wearing freezer t-shirts, disturbing everyone else's peace. But that's just not my issue at the moment. My issue is when it comes to choosing transport in any country, not just France. Not everyone wants to have the same options. Some people like the privacy that a car allows, or the ability to go anywhere at any time. A judgment-free zone where you are far less likely to be accosted for looking at someone funny, or told to get in the back because of the colour of your skin. Or if you're unlucky to be someone like me travelling through Leeds on the day they won their championship, subjected to this. The advert is just bad. It makes several fallacious arguments in trying to attract a customer base who, unless they really care that deeply about the environment, aren't ever going to give up their vehicles for any reason. No person who actively maintains an older vehicle, no matter how much trouble it puts them through, is going to want to abandon their entire hobby because an advert tried to guilt-trip them into doing so. Instead, what the advert demonstrates is that the SNCF, Rosa Paris, and the people responsible for this advert are completely unable to understand the special relationships automotive enthusiasts have between themselves and their vehicles. They have patronised and disrespected such a small sector of the market who are already statistically unlikely to use their trains, and as far as I can tell have made them even less likely to use them. As propaganda, this advert fails spectacularly because it is making an issue out of something that quite frankly isn't an issue. Classic car and bike enthusiasts are not clogging up the roads every single day of the year. They are not breaking down every single time they try to have some fun. But the most important fact of the matter is you will not find another group of people on the face of the earth who are less likely to ditch their established transport preferences in favour of public transport if you tried. That is why this advert fails so hard. It is a cringe-worthy attempt at a take that, evidently orchestrated by greying ad executives who are aware of the online urbanist cult and are trying to appeal to them without realising the vast majority of them are unhinged psychopaths. You see, what many people tend to forget about the ongoing online argument concerning transport choice is that in almost every developed country, public transport takes up a far smaller percentage of commuters than personal transport does. This is because militant public transport advocates are an extremely loud and coordinated minority who do not represent the will nor the desires of most people. This report from 2019 reveals a stark but unsurprising truth in regards to France, where even those who live within 2 kilometers of their workplace will still choose to drive 50% of the time. And the reason behind this is simple, because in spite of the fact that France is one of the most comprehensive public transport systems in the world, trains cannot be made more efficient than cars in any factor outside of passenger volume. Bigger trains need their own rails, carriages, stations, sidings, and all the other pieces of infrastructure they require, growing bigger and more expensive until you end up with this 50-lane monstrosity which bifurcates Munich at its heart and prevents people who otherwise live 5 minutes from each other from walking directly to each other's house. And guess what? Even after taking up all that space, the German national rail service still apparently sucks. Smaller trams might be able to utilize the pre-existing road network and thus provide a more local service, which larger trains aren't able to do and for much cheaper running costs, but all it takes is one selfish idiot to walk in front of one to bring the whole thing to a stop, since rail transport's major unavoidable Achilles heel is that they can't go around obstacles. Above all else, what this advert was a major missed opportunity from the SNCF to create literally anything but this misinformative propaganda piece that serves no one's best interests except the many contrarians, public rejects and shut-ins who reside on the internet. If they wanted to target road traffic, they could have at least been whimsical about it. They could have done something similar to what British Rail did in the 1980s with this advert.
When was the last time you made a long business trip and your train had to stop for breakfast? Stop for you to do some work? Or stop to spend a penny? When did you last see a train with a puncture? Or a train get nicked for speeding? Who's ever heard of a train jam? See your dealer about an Intercity 125. Much quicker, we think, than your 1.6, your 2.3, or 2.8. Intercity.
Sure, the service still sucked, but you can't tell me this wasn't at least funny. The fact it's still remembered many years from its original airing and the master tape saved from a skip is testament to this. The SNCF's advert, meanwhile, is doomed to be forgotten before the 2020s are even over. Its only legacy will be that it will serve as the unwitting prototype for all future public transport adverts who, rather than boast of the actual advantages their service offers, will instead deign to take yet more idiotic shots at users of private transport. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, please consider becoming a subscriber or supporter, as your generous donations are what help to keep this channel going. Links to my Patreon and Ko-Fi are in the description. Thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.